Welcome everyone. And if you're having any kind of technical difficulties, just put something in the chat, and our Wonder Communications Officer Juliet will magically take care of everything for us, I think. So welcome to the INPE Roundtable series. I am delighted. My name's Sharon. Well, you can see it's my name's Sharon Todd here. I'm president of the organization, and I am really pleased to that the board has tried to sort of inaugurate these series of online events in order to draw people into sort of membership as well. So this is also a way of trying to keep the community kind of together in between conferences, which I think it is something that we will not stop once our COVID restrictions are over. I think that this is something that we definitely want to continue on with. And I really want to thank Morten Korsgaard for actually suggesting this. I know I kind of tapped you on the shoulder a little bit, but only after you had contacted me because you were really interested in putting something together. And so I really appreciate that. So I really want to welcome Morten Korsgaard and Johan Dahlbeck from Malmö University in Sweden, and along with Douglas Yacek, Nushin Hosseini-Eckhardt from University of Dortmund from Germany. So, and the roundtable today is what we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how, on the role of exemplarity in teacher education. And so what we'll do is, I think each of you will present for Morten. Do you want me to chair formally, or do I need to keep people to a certain time?
I think it would be great if you try to keep us on time. We have agreed to have maybe 10 minutes each or thereabouts, and we'll try to be precise with that. But do let us know if we go over time.
I'm good at that. That's great. So I'll keep you to about 10 minutes each. And then what we'll do is we will open it up for discussion. It's a nice intimate group. For those of you who haven't joined us before, we're really not a scary bunch, and we really enjoy kind of getting involved in any kind of conversation. And with our international perspectives here, I'm really looking forward to hearing about different ways of thinking about the topic, because it's such a rich topic around teacher education that you're talking about. So I'll hand it over to the panel, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And I think on behalf of all four of us, I really want to thank you for this opportunity. It's something that we've just begun. So it's in the very initial stages, and we've actually only had sort of one conversation about this previously, but we're determined, I think, all the four of us, to continue this conversation. And this is then a sort of first step, and we'd be delighted to get your reactions on our presentations today. But first off, I'm going to give the word to Johan, and then we're just going to go around and do our presentations, and then hopefully have a good discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Morten, and thank you, Sharon, and everyone else here for inviting us for this. I'm actually going to read a very brief paper just to make sure that I keep the time, because otherwise I think I'll be either not talking about anything or just taking way too much time. But before I start, I would just like to add that I don't know how clear that has been, but I think the setting is that we start up from 4 different points of view in relation to historical thinkers, more or less modern. So I will start off by trying to tease out some notes on Spinoza's ideas of exemplarism, because I've spent a number of years now working on Spinoza's ideas about education, or ideas that I find relevant for education. So I've tried to put together something about the few things there are about his notion about the exemplar or exemplarism. So and I'm not going to provide you with a lot of quotes from Spinoza. So if you want to know more about that stuff, you're welcome to contact me, and I can give you. I've done the sort of exegetical work, but I'm not going to sort of throw a lot of quotes on you this afternoon. So I call this contribution Spinoza's 2 exemplars, and it's not going to be there's not going to be terrible amount on teacher education, but hopefully there's some stuff that can at least be food for thought. So Spinoza's two exemplars is the theme. So there are two different kinds of exemplar in Spinoza, or perhaps it is two different interpretations of what would best correspond with Spinoza's idea of an exemplar. So I'm going to suggest that one is pedagogically relevant and the other is not, or at least far less so. And curiously, the one that is not pedagogically relevant most seems to resemble the kind of exemplar of Linda Zaksepski's influential neo-Aristotelian tradition, representing a supremely admirable person. So very briefly, Zaksepski's exemplarism builds on a model of admiration emulation, where a person's admiration is taken to be activated by exemplars exhibiting truly virtuous behavior. So this kind of exemplar comes across as, in some respects at least, morally infallible and therefore as supremely admirable. So in Spinoza's case, the first kind of exemplar, that is an exemplar that is infallible and therefore supremely admirable, is introduced in the guise of his model of human nature, which is called the free man, or homo liber in the original Latin, in part 4 of the Ethics. So the other exemplar is fallible, but it is practically applicable as it is effectively attuned to the imagination of the people addressed. So this latter exemplar is introduced in Spinoza's theological political treatise, and it's cast in the role of the prophet or the teacher of doctrine. So these are the two sort of exemplars, the homo liber model of human nature and the prophet. So the tension between the two kinds of exemplar tells us something important about the problem with standard versions of exemplarism, where the exemplar is conceived as being supremely admirable and therefore also as difficult, if at all possible, to attain through emulation. So it also tells us something important about what is pedagogically interesting about exemplars concerning the accommodation of collective narratives, the dynamics between the imagination and reason, and the pedagogical importance of being attuned to someone else's affective makeup, or to use Spinoza's preferred term, ingenium. So let's look briefly at the two contrasting exemplars in Spinoza. So the free man, or the model of human nature. First, we have the ethical exemplar of the free man introduced in the Ethics, which is perfectly free and virtuous. And it's a model that is conceived as universally valid. It's not action guiding because it's beyond good and evil, right? So it's perfectly rational beyond good and evil. It's a philosophical model of human nature, if you will. And some have argued, and I'm inclined to agree, that it's more of a thought experiment. What if there was such a being as a perfectly rational person? What would that kind of being be like? How would that person reason, etc.? So that's how I interpret this model. So the model of human nature addresses reason, but it also presupposes reason to make sense. So it kind of precludes emulation, as it would be senseless for someone imperfect to emulate the behavior of someone perfect. So I know that Justin Steinberg has an example where it would be like a student who's struggling with a subject trying to emulate someone who already knows it, right? So then you wouldn't need to study, but that would sort of lead to failure. So there's no sort of it's not set up for emulation in that sense. So that's the model of human nature on the one hand. And then we have the prophet, or the teacher of doctrines. So this would be a pedagogical and political exemplar of where Spinoza uses mostly Moses, the figure of Moses in the TTP, his theological political treatise. So this character is presented as supremely imaginative, right? It's not perfectly reasonable at all, but is equipped with a very good sense of imagination. And also, Moses is portrayed as being very well accommodated to the ingenium, that is the effective makeup of the Hebrews. So this is an exemplar that is action guiding because it adheres to a conventional understanding of morality, of good and evil. And it is geared at securing political stability, which for Spinoza is conceived as a precondition for the freedom of philosophizing, which is kind of what the state is geared at. That's the end goal is for everyone to be able to enjoy the freedom of philosophizing, but this is sort of a precondition for that. So it's a practical exemplar that addresses the imagination, and it does not presuppose reason, but also importantly, it does not contradict reason. So, but it may also be conceived as a benevolent form of indoctrination by way of emotional manipulation. So there's a darker aspect to it, if you will. So the starting point for Spinoza's exemplarism in this political setting is that people in general are far less rationally motivated than they tend to think that they are. That is, people do not, none of us do, exert the kind of volitional control over emotional responses to forces around us in the world that we often like to think that we do, and that political philosophers have often assumed. So, and also emotions and affects are conceived as highly contagious. And so we're much more prone to be influenced by each other, for good or for bad, than we tend to be aware of or to acknowledge. So Spinoza grounds this in his doctrine of the imitation of affects, which is outlined in part 3 of the Ethics. And the upshot of this for an exemplarist moral theory is that the cognitive capacities of an individual will not make for a terribly reliable instrument when it comes to securing the emulation of admirable behavior. So something else is needed to inspire and to guide action. So instead, exemplarism must account for the human tendency to be moved by passions and to harness the productive aspects of the naturally occurring imitation of affects. So while the fact that emotions and affects are highly contagious, while that can often be a problem, because that's also partly what explains why negative emotions like fear, suspicion, and hatred spread easily, it's also the very thing that enables the efficacy of exemplarism. So insofar as the exemplar, in the form of the teacher or the narrative related, is attuned to the ingenium of the group addressed, the people of the group will be more readily affected by the emotions conveyed. So there's a kind of imitation of emotions going on. So we can never share another person's ingenium fully. We can only ever approximate it insofar as we share common experiences and insofar as we adhere to similar social norms and share traditions. So common experiences and common social, political, and social cultural frameworks therefore play an important role for how Spinoza conceives of the exemplar. So let's just briefly look at 3 kind of central aspects or presuppositions of Spinoza's exemplarism that would be important from an educational point of view. So one aspect is that narratives enlisted, the narratives that are enlisted in education, they should be accommodated to people's imagination in order to be able to do something. So in order to be able to inspire and guide actions rather than be perfectly reasonable or be modeled after reason. And second, which is kind of a balance to that, is that for Spinoza, the imagination is an inadequate form of cognition or knowledge, what he calls cognitio, but it can be used to initiate virtuous circles of affects. And Andrea San Giacomo has written a really interesting book about this notion of circles of affects, where something that starts out being passive can be turned into something passive if it's done in a certain way. So the trick then would be to sort of exploit passive affects that are empowering rather than debilitating. So there's not a whole lot that you can do about things like fear and hatred, but there are other passive affects that you can actually use in order to build community. So it would be to exploit these affects that are empowering rather than debilitating, socially cohesive rather than divisive, and therefore it provides an effective bridge kind of between passivity and activity. So that's the second one. The third one is that this notion of ingenium and a person's ingenium corresponding with her effective makeup. And the important thing here is that this is both individual and social, as affects are both individual and social. So when we share history and tradition, we also share, to some degree at least, a collective ingenium that can be tapped into by way of collective narratives and popular fictions. So Spinoza's pedagogical exemplars, Moses in this case, makes use of collective narratives to appeal to the imagination of the Hebrews. And because Moses is well acquainted with the ingenium of the Hebrews, he can make them strive in concert so as to establish a stable republic where they will be provided with the safety to eventually be able to enjoy the freedom of philosophizing. But the freedom of philosophizing is not, however, an action guiding principle in itself, but it must be preceded by social stability and obedience to common laws from Spinoza's point of view, which he believes should be promoted through public processes of civic formation. So it's important to note that Moses is not conceived as an ethical exemplar to emulate, but as a kind of pedagogical exemplar insofar as he illustrates the importance of being attuned to the ingenium of one's students. So Spinoza uses Moses as an exemplary narrative in turn, pointing out ideas about political governance that he believes would be applicable or interesting to consider for 17th century Dutch Republic. So for Spinoza, the value of an exemplar is directly related to the degree to which it can appeal to someone's imagination, so as to arouse a sense of passive joy. So its purpose is not to relate philosophical truth, because philosophical truth is not action guiding in itself. It sort of, it just is.
That's 10 minutes, Johan.
Okay, so I'm just going to conclude with just briefly. So Spinoza's lesson for teacher education seems to be that without appealing to the imagination of students, exemplars will be inherently impotent. For the model of human nature to function as an exemplar, the students would already need to be living according to the guidance of reason. So imaginative narratives, on the other hand, have the benefit of drawing on shared experience and shared history, and they can help induce passive joys that in turn can be cultivated into active affects, as they appeal to a shared moral framework rather than to philosophical truth. They are also action guiding. So thank you for listening. I think I'm handing over to you, Doug.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Johan. So my talk, I'm going to be writing into this discussion of exemplarity on a somewhat different stallion. My stallion is Nietzsche, not Spinoza. And I wouldn't be maybe as ostentatious as riding into this discussion on a donkey, but we are talking about exemplars, and so I hope you will forgive my biblical reference there. The focus of my talk is in particular on an aspect of exemplarity that Johan already mentioned, and that I think is something that is quite complex and important for developing the right kind of relationship to our exemplars, and yet that tends to be reduced to a certain kind of simplistic model that requires, I think, some more thinking through, and that is emulation. So as Johan already mentioned, emulation is the partner principle in exemplarity to admiration. It's sort of the transformative side of exemplarism, which is to say, when we have established a relationship to an exemplar or role model, in which we admire some of their characteristics or actions or principles or whatever it might be, the thing that actually gets us off the couch and into the real world and trying to embody these various principles and virtues is the emulative aspect, is the fact that we try to imitate, in effect, the example that is set by our role models. And generally, there's a kind of standard model of emulation that we see, for example, in Linda Zagzebski's theory, exemplarist moral theory, and sort of in the broader discussion of exemplarism, which says that basically what the way to call out emulation is to imaginatively connect with the particular characteristics and personality traits and actions that our exemplar embodies and performs, and then basically to try to do the same thing in similar situations in our own lives. And of course, there's always an imaginative disconnect, because our situation will never be the exact same, especially when we're sort of distant from our exemplars in history and space as well. And sometimes, of course, we have relationships to exemplars that are in our immediate community or environment, but nonetheless, there's always an imaginative aspect here. And what I'm going to do in the talk is just outline three species of emulation that are somewhat different than this standard model, and that I think are crucial as supplements to ensure that that ultimately the relationship that we establish of emulation to our exemplar doesn't break down. Okay, sorry, everyone's hearing me, right? I just heard a random sound. Okay, good. And in particular, I think there are three risks that we run without these supplemental species of emulation that I'm going to draw from Nietzsche. The first risk is that when we begin to imitate our exemplary role model, we can experience a loss of autonomy. So this is pretty straightforward. Our imitation becomes so mechanical that we actually lose the capacity, or we're losing the sense in which our own actions are the production of our moral agency. and then we cease to be living kind of an authentic life, and we're just sort of blindly copying what we see embodied in the exemplar. And of course, autonomy is a value in itself, and so losing that is a problem. But it also leads to a kind of unstable moral learning that occurs. So we will be less adept at actually responding to our moral environment, or intellectual environment for that matter, if we have just sort of mechanically tried to imitate the qualities that we see in our exemplar. So the second risk that we run is that if we fail to actually perform this emulative function, we can begin to project the problem onto the exemplar. So this breeds a kind of resentment or hatred, in fact, that Johan was mentioning in his talk just now. Or oppositely, if this distance becomes so great, we might fall into a kind of resignation. So this is almost the opposite psychological response. We've so glorified our exemplar, we've so imaginatively distanced ourselves from them that their example is no longer action guiding for us. Of course, Johan, this was a theme in Johan's presentation as well. And the three species that I'm going to talk about now will respond to each of these risks in turn. So what are these species of emulation? The first might seem a little bit like a contradiction in terms, but it is one that I think is very important, and it's quite present in Nietzsche's own thinking, and that is self-emulation. So for Nietzsche, he thinks that in order to establish the right kind of relationship to an exemplar that is not ourselves, we need to first, as a basis, emulate ourselves to a certain degree. Now, there are several places where he talks about self-emulation. One big topic for Nietzsche is self-overcoming, for example. This is throughout his corpus, and he has a whole philosophy of self-overcoming. I'm not going to focus on that, but rather on an idea, or maybe a kind of more developed philosophy of self-emulation that you find in his early essay, Schopenhauer as Educator. So in this early essay, Nietzsche says that ultimately we need to recognize a higher self that each one of us has. And that the task of self-emulation is the task of trying to actualize that higher self to a certain extent. So I'll just read a passage. I will indulge in reading you some Nietzsche. Johan held himself back quite admirably. I will not hold myself back in that way. So Nietzsche says, for example, at the beginning of Schopenhauer's Educator, let the youthful soul look back on life with the question, what have you truly loved up to now? What has elevated your soul? What has mastered it and at the same time delighted it? Place these venerated objects before you in a row, and perhaps they will yield for you through their nature and their sequence a law, the fundamental law of your true self. Compare these objects, see how one complements, expands, surpasses, transfigures another. And this is the interesting thing. He's mentioned the true self. And now he says how these things form a step ladder upon which you have climbed up to yourself as you are now. For your true nature lies not hidden deep within you, but immeasurably high above you. The crucial point here is that Nietzsche thinks that we need to have this sense of the higher self in order to establish the right kind of relationship to our role models and exemplars. In fact, what he says is that what makes our role models exemplary is the fact that they are able to actualize their higher selves much more frequently and consistently than we can. And so I think this is something that's quite provocative. And sometimes people are a little bit skeptical, like, do I really have a higher self? I'm not so sure. What does he mean by this? Well, I don't know about you, but I got myself up off the couch a few minutes ago, and I was eating banana bread and drinking a coffee with a lot of sugar in it. And now I'm giving a talk on Nietzsche. And I know if I just was left to my own devices, I might still be on that couch, and I might have turned on Netflix. So I know I've got a lower self. And the self that I am right now is, maybe it's not my highest self, but it's definitely higher than the one previously. So I think that this is what Nietzsche is talking about. And ultimately, this is what connects us to our role models in a way that helps us avoid the problem of autonomy loss when we start to imitate them. What we're imitating in them is precisely what makes us authentic. Okay, the next species of emulation beyond self-emulation, the second one, is what we might call agonistic emulation. This is a form of emulation that happens actually between peers. Now, the word agon is in the middle of the first term in this concept I've just introduced. The agon or agonism is a really important idea for Nietzsche. It's gotten a lot of play in recent political theory. Sometimes people connect it back to Nietzsche. It's also very widely misunderstood. Some people take Nietzsche's notion of agonism to imply some kind of sort of rigorous competition against others to dominate them and to express power over them. And it's all about the will to power. Now, of course, Nietzsche cares very much about power and wants us to express it in certain kinds of ways, but he does not think that true power is domination of others or overpowering them or subordinating them or something. Rather, Nietzsche thinks that the highest forms of power are sort of internal. They're the kinds of things where we take our internal drives and effects and we sublimate them and channel them into outlets of expression, artistic expression, intellectual expression, philosophy, art, literature, and things like this. And what Nietzsche has in mind with agonistic competition that can arise between relationships and between peers is one that brings the best out of both sides of that competition. So just one quick passage of his, he says, for example, one ought not to want to win if one has the prospect of overtaking one's opponent by only a hair's breadth. If it's that close, that means you are in a really special kind of competition. He says, the good victory must be the conquered, must put the conquered into a joyful mood. It must possess something divine that does not put to shame. And I think here, I mean, what he's saying is that when we are engaged in these special kinds of relationships where we're trying to bring out the best, where we're both sort of struggling to be excellent to the extent that we can, the point then becomes much broader than just winning that competition or overcoming our opponent. It becomes, in a sense, the joy of witnessing excellence in ourselves and in the other person to the extent that we can express it. And I think someone who really captures this idea well, and it's an idea that I think is also quite important for teacher education, I have another passage from a 19th century educational theorist named Joseph Emerson.
That's 10 minutes, Doug.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to wrap up quickly. He says, I never indulged in hating a rival, nor for an hour, nor had occasion to strive against him. If for a moment I ever felt the stir of envy in consequence of sudden and grievous discomfiture, it was but for a moment. Nay, my rivals have been among my dearest friends. The stimulating influence of such a friend and rival I consider to be one of the greatest blessings I have enjoyed. To be seated continually at his side, sometimes above him, though frequently more below him, to see his intense application, his untiring patience, his vigorous efforts for improvement, his unexceptionable morals and propriety of conduct could not but be favorable to my progress. And the turn to progress at the end is, I think, gets at this sort of transformative side of things. And, you know, friendships like this that are aspirational and agonistic in this way tend to fall outside the purview of teacher education. And yet I think we can do a lot better at actually supporting students and developing these special kinds of relationships. They're the ones that tend to accompany us throughout our lives. Okay, the last form of emulation that I'm going to talk about very quickly, because I'm already past my time. I can't believe it. I knew I shouldn't be reading Nietzsche aloud, but I couldn't help myself. I already mentioned it. Is what we might call exemplary fallibilism. And again, this is something that Johan touched on. The idea is that we actually have something to learn and something quite special and unique from looking at how our exemplars fail. And in our exemplars actually making how they fail and how they grapple with setbacks and hardships available to the people, to other people outside of them. And the idea here is that this is one of the ways, this is kind of the other side of the coin to seeing our exemplars as people who also are sort of pursuing their higher selves. They're going to struggle, just as we do, to actualize that consistently and frequently. And so we sort of see them and do so. And for example, in Schopenhauer's Educator, Nietzsche says, even the greatest of men cannot attain to his own ideal, that Schopenhauer, Nietzsche's exemplar in this case, can offer us a model as certain, all the scars and blemishes notwithstanding. One might say indeed that in his nature, which was imperfect and all too human, brings us closer to him in a human sense, for it lets us see him as a fellow sufferer and not only in the remote heights of a genius. And there again, I think it helps us grapple with this sort of resignation risk that lurks in the emulation relationship. And of course, it's something that's really important for teacher education. We like to give teachers, aspiring teachers, finished theories and models of how to teach. We embody ourselves a lot of experience in teaching. I think it would do them a service to try to show them that failure, experimentation is very much a part of becoming a teacher, and creating an environment where they can test things out and fail themselves is also, I think, a really important contribution. Okay, well, thanks for listening and sorry for going over.
Now I have a lot of things to think about, but also you put the salmon of banana bread and coffee in my head, which I have to follow later. Today I would like to talk to you about Walter Benjamin, a German philosopher, and my talk also kind of puts the notion of failure and fragment and how education has a core point in opening up the world to yourself and to others. So I will read it out. I will try to stick to Johan. So sorry for that if I'm too fast. So sorry. Yeah. So my talk today is structured along 3 sections dealing with the programmatic work in progress of the German philosopher Walter Benjamin. So our starting point will be an unsteady theoretical ground of Benjamin's works as described as the semantics of the fragment, as I said before. The second section will deal with Benjamin's methods, such as the archaeological approaches to philosophy as an opening up to the world. My hypothesis here is that these methods already at that time implicitly introduce the new concepts of hybridity. At last, there will be a motivation to discuss some didactical outcomes of his approach to opening up the world. Benjamin's so-called semantics of the fragment derives not only from the fact that there is not only explicit drawn semantics in his various works, furthermore, his approach to objects of the world is marked by explicitly dealing with fragments. Hannah Arendt once called him a pearl diver. Criticizing main narratives of philosophical historicism, like Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's perception of history as a sign of evolution, Benjamin otherwise tries nothing less than generating a new kind of a more egalitarian philosophy of history, to near a broader history and contemporary truth. With all that, he explicitly turns the perspective onto the untold stories of the margins of society. In his legendary project, Das Passagenwerk, started 1927 and has never been accomplished, he digs up heterogeneous documents of history by gathering various texts, notes, and quotes. In this sense, also, his sources are social groups such as salespersons, sex workers, psychoanalytics, revolutionaries, or even machines. All those little spaces of history, Benjamin tries to draw, Benjamin tries to draw a genealogy of rising capitalism. His new philosophy of history is theoretically built on the worth of little, even ugly things like bricks, shingles, waste, and ruins. That will be the future of current cathedrals like malls. There won't be a lot of quotes in my talk, but in the sense of the semantics of the fragment, you will have a lot of terms of Walter Benjamin, which I use in that. So Walter Benjamin archaeological approach to philosophy is marked by literally unearthing subjects and objects of historical relevance and gathering those as documents of the past and also the current times. What makes this approach to opening up to the world even more interesting is his way of arranging and analyzing those objects. Leaning his method on the atlas of the art historian A.B. Warburg, Benjamin's resistance against traditional, linear, and systematic ways of thinking shows itself in finding other ways of arranging objects of knowledge. In dealing with truthful but transient moments of history, Benjamin puts in order materialistic documents randomly, not hierarchical, and by that he implicitly introduces methods of hybridity. These hybrid methods are marked by a mixing together of what is according to the hegemony of epistemological standards to be kept separated. In the same hybrid spirit, Benjamin also combines materialistic and also even religious figures of thought to introduce his philosophical ideas, such as messianic moments of understanding or moments of epiphany in the shattering of the dialectics. By this, he tries to install moments of dealing with ongoing processes by slowing it down or even stopping the continuum of the ongoing. According to Benjamin, this is an emancipatory act which can show you the possibility of, time and again, gaining back control over your being in the world. Moreover, it also points to the possibility of thinking differently and actively arranging the objects of the world in a different way. In the field of education, the approach to opening up to the world through ways of archaeologists, just of philosophy, additionally needs teachers as translators of philosophy. So they won't be only the archaeologists of philosophy, but also the translators. They are the ones that should create pedagogical spaces in which such occasions are organized, motivated, and also communicated. A didactic learning on Benjamin's semantics of the fragment bind core ideas of philosophy of education at the same time by provoking space for questions and maybe even finding answers. This space is not necessarily at the end of the question, but is taken much more seriously as it gives the students an authority to first see and gather what is important to them, and second, draw a sense of it to a broader world themselves. They are activated to create constellations, which is a Benjamin's term, of sense and fill in those empty spaces between those by themselves. The pedagogical effects are on many levels as they initiate new ways of looking at the world, finding connections with it through materialistic, gathering other people's garbage, stickers, graffitis, and so on, and expecting those to surprise you with moments of philosophical epiphany. What to me is exemplary about Walter Benjamin is the way he achieves to combine a clear social political position with, on the other hand, non-traditional or non-dogmatic and maybe even hybrid means of approaching the world. If you want to stay in the picture of the pearl diver, with Benjamin's methods of the archaeology of philosophy, teachers and students can stretch the pedagogical space by the explicitly given time and the recognition of their perspective on the world, explicitly, especially in these little things. As archaeologists and translators of philosophy, teachers and students are also being given a kind of freedom to dive through what makes sense to them. And in communicating that, they may even inspire others to see pearls where they only used to see garbage before. So I don't know in which time I am, whether I was too fast, sorry for that, but
no problem. You're under 10 minutes, so thank you.
I did it for the team.
Well done, Nushin.
Okay, so I will try to also keep the time, but if I go over, I will just simply say that Nushin left me some time, which is nice. She also left me a cue for how to open my presentations, because this idea of finding pearls is something quite dear to me, and I love that metaphor. And sometimes you find those pearls in familiar but unexpected places. I was going to, in this presentation, I was going to focus on an interpretation or working a bit further with Arendt's notion of going visiting, and an interpretations of the role of friendship and company in her work. But then there's an article by Jürgen Oelkers on influence and development that Johan and I have actually been using for quite a while, both in doctoral courses, but in our master program and elsewhere, and reading this article. And we've used it mainly for sort of historical purposes, because it gives an outline of a development in educational theory that we find is interesting and illuminating for students. But then during a discussion not long ago about this article, something occurred to me that there was more here and that I wanted to explore, and that I could somehow connect this to what I'd been doing with Arendt. So that's what I'm going to try to outline today. And it's very initial, so I don't know if it's going to work out, but bear with me, and then you can tell me afterwards if it's all wrong. Okay, so in this article, Oelkers tries to outline two basic paradigms in educational theory. So one paradigm that he uses the metaphor of influence for, and he has as his main protagonist in describing that John Locke. And the other one is development, where he has as his main protagonist Rousseau, and mainly his ideas in Emile. I'm not going to go very much into to these two perspectives, because I think you can guess them. But on the one hand, we have Locke, who sees influence or direct influence on the child's development as something that is central. So through reasoning, we cultivate reason and we build rational thinking people. And then on the other hand, we have Rousseau, who says that we shouldn't have this kind of direct influence, at least immediately, in the course of educating people. Rather, we should build environments wherein the natural sort of inclinations and the natural forces and drives within the child can develop, hence the metaphor of development. What's interesting in Oelkers' analysis, I rediscovered, is that they both sort of hinge on the idea of an inner unified world that can somehow be observed, and that the learning and developing process of which they can be evaluated in connection to specific normative view of the world and what a good life is. So in a sense, they are both individualistic and teleological, but more importantly, with the influence these two paradigms have had on educational theory or educational thinking, they've led to the idea that education concerns the promotion or strengthening of inner dispositions that in turn form some kind of unity or identity that can be evaluated. So we can somehow get a view of how the inner dispositions in a child or in a person develop into a kind of unity that can then be evaluated or assessed in relation to whatever aim it is we have for education. Now, Oelkers has two issues with this image. One is the fact that the idea of a unified self composed of acquired disposition is at best a linguistic fiction. And secondly, even if we accept this fiction as something that's useful or valuable for describing this, because it is an interpretation, the inner self is not, because we can describe it, transparent, and therefore it doesn't lend itself very well to the evaluation of the kinds that are proposed within the metaphors of development and influence. As an alternative to this, Oelkers proposes an idea of education as a form of moral communication. But before I return to this, I want to focus on an accompanying yet underexplored aspect in this analysis that Oelkers provides us with regards to the role of the teacher. And of course, in both Locke and in Rousseau, there are educators, plural educators, in the frame and in the descriptions that are very different, of course. But they both focus on the role of adults as exemplars in upbringing. And I want to read parts of two sections from Locke's text, his letter on education, and from Emile very quickly. So Locke states that, I imagine everyone will judge it reasonable that their children, when little, should look upon their parents as their lords, their absolute governors, and as such stand in awe of them. And that when they come to riper years, they should look on them as their best, as their only sure friends, and as such love and reverence them. And a bit further on, he says that we must look upon our children when grown up to be like ourselves, with the same passions, the same desires, unquote. So there's this idea in Locke that a rational parent should aim to educate his child in this image of the rational parent, or rational self in a sense. And this, of course, is transposed into an image of the teacher as this rational being that can reason with the children and stand as an exemplar of learning those skills. Rousseau has a slightly different take on this, and I'm going to read a different quote here. So Rousseau says that it would be necessary that the governor had been raised for his pupil, that the pupil's domestics had been raised for their master, that all those who have contact with him had received the impressions that they ought to communicate with him. It would be necessary to go from education to education, back to I know not where. How is it possible that a child be well raised by one who was not well raised himself? But let us suppose this marvel found. So that's the basis sort of Rousseau's fiction in Emile, that we found this marvel, this teacher that in fact is Emile as an adult, if we take this interpretation a step further. So there is this idea present here that education is a sort of individual cultivation of inner dispositions, and you need a teacher, a tutor, an exemplar in a sense, in order to facilitate this process, whether that's a process of building natural environments or a process of direct influence is not really what I highlight here, but it's essential that it's this sort of relation. And this hasn't really changed. I mean, we often tend, even though we speak of teachers and educators in the plural, we often tend to focus on this particular relationship of individual teachers to individual or more students. And of course, that's natural, because in most cases, teachers are alone in the classroom. So I think it's a sort of natural tendency to describe it in this way. It also leads to exemplarity being understood as a sort of one-to-one relation, or as one particular teacher being an exemplary one. But I think with Oelker's critique in mind, we can challenge this image and focus instead perhaps of a more collective perspective on what's going on here. So if we don't see education as a process of promoting inner disposition in order to form a singular unified teacher sub, but rather in terms of moral communication, then how can we begin to see teacher education differently? But of course, first we need a definition of moral education. And I want to read two quotes from Oelker here that sort of pinpoint what he's talking about. By moral communication, I mean processes of negotiating which deal with morality, i.e. with normative demarcations within the framework of social group. So it's a form of moral communication within a group, and naturally there are limits and demarcations to where that communication can go, but it's a form of communication between social groups. And when speaking about children, Oelker says that moral communication with children becomes specific due to the latter's novice status. Children do not develop towards morality in order to attain or not to attain the highest stages, i.e. remote objectives. Rather, children learn the conditions for participating in moral communication, unquote. So what we're aiming for here, what I try or what I see in UCAS is actually a form of communication that is both sort of moral and ethical in nature, but is also aimed at giving access to the very form of communication or the set of practices themselves. And as an example of this form of communication, I want to turn to the promise, the Remtian perspectives, and perhaps a bit odd example in this context. But Arendt famously proposed that we understand Kant's theory of judgment in political terms, and that one central aspect of this was the ability to go visiting. If this is the case, it's of course central who one visits. And in a quote from Responsibility and Judgment, we can read that our decisions about right and wrong will depend upon our choice of company, of those with whom we wish to spend our lives. And again, this company is chosen by thinking in examples of persons dead or alive, real or fictitious, and in examples of incidents, past or present.
That's 10 minutes.
Okay, I want to suggest here that this is not merely a philosophical or literary point, but in fact, a question of living life with the right exemplars. So Arendt hinted at this already in her biography of Rahel Verhagen and her descriptions of the famous Berlin salons. And if we're to believe her friends, she actually lived out this very principle in her home when entertaining and having guests. And I was going to read a poem to you by one of her friends, but I'm going to skip that. But it basically describes the dinner party at the Arendtbrücker house as a conversations where not only the individual guests' perspectives come to life, but also Socrates, Faulkner, Homer, Kafka, Nietzsche, and so on come to life in this company through the communication that is going on whatever topic it is. Now, what comes out of this form of collective and moral communication is what Arendt in a letter to Hermann Brock described as essential intellectual processes. So to conclude, I want to suggest that we rethink teacher education and the role of exemplars in this as a much more collective process with an emphasis on communication and perhaps even friendship rather than individual improvement of inner dispositions. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all. They're very, very rich. They interconnect and yet they're so different as well, the presentations. So thank you to all four of you. I just want, before I open this up, I think it's just good to have a sense of how to go about doing this. I can see most of you, but some of you might slip off screen. So at the bottom of your screen, you will see participants chat, share screen, record, and then a little icon with reactions. And if you press on the icon, there's a raise hand icon there, so you'll be sure to be seen. But if I don't see you for whatever reason, please just wave me down or just kind of hop in when it's time. So I think that's good. But bye, Jeff. Nice to see you. I know you have to go off teaching now. Great that you could join us. Okay, so we open it up. Lots of rich stuff here around exemplarity and teacher education and teaching more generally, actually. So who would like to sort of open the floor? I will. Okay. That was easy. One of the things that struck me about the presentations was the notion of exemplarity as role model. So I wasn't entirely sure sometimes whether exemplarity could be something other than being attached to a human person. Particularly when Nushin, you were talking about that you know the archaeology, the semantic of the fragments, that objects themselves actually are something one dives for in order to make meaning out of. So I'm kind of interested in how you were actually understanding exemplarity in each of your presentations and what maybe had you considered kind of not thinking about them in totally humanistic kind of ways?
You want to go first, Nushin, or should I?
Okay, I can. I'll start. Thank you. To me, this what I wanted to emphasize with the exemplarity was just to show how people see others. This is a very simple point of it, to see how do you see others, and this is to me a very core point of education and also of philosophy, which binds together this two disciplines, and or the others also as the world. And Walter Benjamin is for me a very good example, to my mind, of how someone tries to open up his own view on his own and the world. And there is a very interesting literature of how Benjamin walks through Naples and other cities and just describes the stones and the cathedrals and all the big and little things of monuments of cities, and just like walking with him through the world. And in time of the pandemic times, it's also very interesting, but it's just like it fits to the notion of the company, as Morten said with Arendt, just who are you walking with and talking with, and how do you share their perspective of the world and combine it. So this is also that he doesn't force us some view on things, but he gives us this fragments of and what I said stretches the space of how to go through the world and just find pleasure in a little thing. So to me, this is a kind of method he actually shows us. So it's not him who is the exemplar, but the method of looking at things and looking at the world is very very exemplary for me. Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think we agree that we want to use the term exemplarity for a fairly wide variety of activities, and I think exemplarity as a phenomenon goes across all educational practices. I mean, it's instantiated the minute we say, for example. In any sort of pedagogical situation, we use examples to illustrate things or to give access for students to things, and I think that functions at the level of objects and humans and across sort of all the vast variety of human existence or life on Earth, if you will, where this sort of this use of examples is in play. It's not just that we do it only intentionally, we also do it unintentionally a lot of the times.
I see Johan wants to come in, and then we'll go to Kai for the next question.
So just briefly, I think that I think that's one of the things that, if my memory serves me, reading Linda Sexebsky's book on exemplarist moral theory, that, as far as I remember, is almost exclusively focused on people being exemplars. And I think that's one of the limitations of that. And actually, Morten, you wrote a paper a while back about where you make this kind of distinction between pedagogical exemplars, ethical exemplars, and didactical exemplars. And I think that's a fairly useful distinction. And actually, Spinoza works with both kinds of exemplars. So on the one hand, there are exemplars that are characters, people, if you will, but there's also this notion that there can be exemplary narratives that are not necessarily about a person, but that's supposed to tell us something, to feed our imagination, to make us think about things. So I think that's it's like kind of a useful distinction. Of course, there's some aspect of it connects with being human, I think.
Thanks a lot, Johan. We have Kai and then Karl-Anders.
Thanks very much to all four presenters on a really stimulating, riveting set of presentations. there's a beautiful German word that I covered in a paper some, I don't know, of 13 years ago, Vorleben, which actually means, well, very difficult to find a proper translation. It means something like living one's life as an emulatable example. Now, I think I'd be quite interested in finding out more how your particular positions would sort of align with that. How you would, if it came to that, accommodate this concept for Vorleben. And I think the closest that I've heard anyone in the presentations come to that is Morten, when you spoke about Hannah Arendt in her home, living out. So I guess that's my question. Is it worth pursuing? Would it be worth pursuing? And how would this idea of Vorleben sort of bear on what you've been working on?
Yeah, I think absolutely, and it sounds like a very interesting concept. I had not thought of that, but I think it's fairly close to maybe what Douglas was talking about in terms of self-emulation, in a sense, or focusing on that consciousness of seeing yourself as someone that sort of goes ahead, that lives ahead. I don't know if that connects with the German word in a sense, but. And I think that's important for teachers, that we see ourselves that as people that sort of live ahead, and not necessarily in that normative way where it becomes this image that I was arguing against of this one exemplar that one student has to accommodate his inner dispositions to, but becomes broader than that. But Douglas, do you maybe want to say something about this?
Sure, Kai, that's a really great question, a really provocative idea, this notion of Vorleben. In a sense, I too also made the connection to this notion of self-emulation first, but I think Nietzsche, in these various species of emulation that I talked about, wants to tap into that notion in various different ways. So just one way we could contrast it is, so there's Vorleben, so living out yourself as an emulatable person or ideal. And then there's might be something we could call Vorhandeln, where it's just reduced to an action. So if you just give me one action, I can do the right thing. But if you watch 10 actions, then you're going to start to see my Leben, my life. You're going to see my failures. You're going to see my moments of greatness and my moments of mistakes and problems and things like that. And so I think one of the ways this comes up is that it's going to make this sort of exemplary fallibilism, the sense in which the ways we encounter our own sort of setbacks and failures, and the way that we see our exemplary role models doing so as being kind of central to this notion. And then also starting to recognize that even though when we make these mistakes, there is a kind of higher sense of ourselves that we can nonetheless strive for. And then thirdly, sort of when we're in a friendship or a relationship with someone else where the point is to try to draw out the best in each other, you recognize immediately that you are visible then to that other person as a kind of example. And so that added sort of consciousness is important because it's kind of an accountability measure, sort of like your friend needs you in order to be your best self so that you draw out his or her best self. And I think that so in a way, I would say Vorleben is kind of one of the ways of tying all of these three species together. So thanks, Kai. I think that's a really interesting idea. I hadn't thought about it before.
Great. We have Carl Anders and then Lovisa.
Yeah. Thank you for the talks. Yeah, I was also thinking of, but then you kind of answered that, Morten, that there was exemplarity, but that it was a very different way of speaking about it, which was I guess, one of the points you're doing. But you know, so it's all from the role model to actually someone giving examples, and I wonder if that become a little bit too big, because I'm thinking about the distinction also between the teacher, as you talk about, as a figure, and teaching as a process, as a procedure. So for me, a kind of basic question is that is it there a teacher who can be defined as someone for, you know, in different kind of contextualizations, theoretical or whatever, who teaches, or is it which already have the name of the teacher then given for some reason or other? Or is it actually the procedure of teaching that produced the teacher and the student and the relationship between it? And why that is important is because I see one lead to a fixed position that then have to be explained and defined and maybe, you know, or the other is a praxis position in which there's something going on that kind of define what is, you know, happening. So for me, that there's a difference between two very different way of thinking. One is more a stasis, it's a static kind of way in which that then have to be built up with different sets of argumentations and references relations. The other is trying to capture something which is always on the move, and I would say that the where you place the exemplarity within these two kind of sets will produce very, very different way of understanding what an example is and how exemplarity work within also a set of a classroom, or where teaching and teachers or whatever are supposed to kind of happen. So yeah, so maybe that's his reflection, but it's also a question if you yourself see yourself with these different approaches kind of on one or the other side of this kind of divide in thinking.
Yeah, I was hesitating to jump in there. I felt like I've spoken enough, but no, I think one point is, as you mentioned, Karl-Anders, that whichever model or whichever view you take of it, exemplarity is there. But I would prefer probably to look at the second one as a form of praxis where this sort of grows out of, and then returning to teacher education, I think I am increasingly learning the value of trying to establish conversations also with students as a more collective sort of process where we collectively interrogate different practices and different ideas and different ideas and different writers, different fictional examples and different ways of going about pedagogical situations or pedagogical roles or paradoxes or dilemmas or whatever. And I think it would be very helpful to move towards that kind of understanding. Again, in Denmark, for example, that was a strong part of the sort of seminarium tradition in teacher education that is disappearing now that it's become university colleges and so on. It's become much more of a sort of machinery with a focus on individual objectives and outcomes and criteria and so on. And that understanding of becoming part of a specific praxis and a specific sort of conversation has disappeared. I don't know if that was answered, but I think we would probably have different perspectives also within our group on that, which for now at least I think is a good thing.
So just to add something to that, and I think this, I guess one of the tricky things about the question is that it's one thing if you ask me, and it's one thing if you ask me what the notion would be from Spinoza's point of view, which I think is what I'm going to attempt to give a brief answer. And the interesting thing there is that there seems to be two really different conceptions of teaching going on at the same time in Spinoza. And one of them is what I would call his notion of civic education, which is quite vertical, and it could be summarized in terms of teaching doctrine, if you will. So that would be kind of state-sponsored narratives that we think are good for promoting peace and stability. So that's one kind that could easily be described in terms of some kind of indoctrination. Then there's a different conception that is completely horizontal and completely egalitarian. And that's when he talks about the notion of giving brotherly advice. So this is a conception of education which is much more aligned with sort of voluntary groups of people getting together to self-cultivate and to help each other. And exemplarism in that setting would be quite different from the vertical notion, because in the vertical notion, there is this idea that whatever narratives are useful are those that inculcate this notion or the stability and peace in the state. But in the other setting, it's whatever we can do to help each other understand more. So they can be completely different, and they're not strictly speaking parallel, because I think that there's way that you can see that from a political point of view, Spinoza thinks that we need the vertical version first. We need the kind of stability first, because otherwise the other setting will be much too vulnerable, and it will be dangerous to philosophize, because people will do things to people who have radical ideas, etc. So there needs to be some kind of basic security first. So I think that's the kind of setup, which of course is also sort of in a specific historical context.
Thank you. We're going to go to Lavisa and then Glenn.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, all four of you, very, very much for very interesting presentations. It gave me a lot of food for thought to bring with me. I guess my reflection is only more one of context, motivation, or intent, perhaps. So I was just wondering if any one of you could say, if it might sound blunt, but why the notion, or why language about the exemplar and exemplarity, and why now? Is there something in the current politics around education, or in the current socio-political debates on education, that you find that this would be an adequate response to? Is that the case, or is it? Yeah, that's sort of. I just wonder about what's this sort of social or practical pedagogical problem, perhaps, that this addresses. And I was happy that you brought in the collective dimension in the end, because I was thinking, if we look at this from the perspective of context, couldn't it be a risk also that we're now sort of decollectivizing the profession of education, singularizing each teacher, so that we are sort of demontera, we're sort of making it more difficult to talk about the profession in collective ways, if you understand what I mean. It could feed into a quite neoliberal discourse on the singular teacher making all the difference. So that's a risk I see. And I was thinking about Edith Visegrad wrote a book a couple of years ago. I think she died a couple of years just after that, called Saints and Postmodernism. She was discussing the notion of exemplarity, seeing that as a way to, in sort of a postmodern theory, get around the big narratives and create some kind of new basis for virtue ethics. That's sort of, I was wondering, is that sort of part of your interest for this, which would be a more philosophical approach? So yeah, just briefly on context, given the notion of translation, because I'm thinking, how do I translate this to teacher education, of course?
Maybe I'll take the first stab. I'm sure we all have slightly different opinions or reasons for coming into this project. my own personal interest is in the ways, I actually think that the focus on exemplars or on especially in teacher education, is something that leads us to recognize the importance of community in becoming a teacher. I mean, I talked about the kinds of peer-to-peer emulation that can occur and that needs to occur, I think, in order to have, I mean, in order not only to have kind of a productive relationship to other kinds of role models that we don't have a direct connection to, but also just to enrich teacher education in general. Typically, you know, we have our classes, but the relationships between students are so fragile or vague or sort of weak that we barely can create any kind of real communal feeling in our classrooms. And the times that does happen, I think really stick out in our memories as a really fun or really successful class that we've taught. So I think the focus on exemplars can actually push against the sort of neoliberal individualism that you're pointing to as a potential problem in teacher education. So that's the first thing I would say. Why talk about it now? I mean, the reason why I personally introduced the various species of emulation is that there is a risk that we think of the kind of the emulation exemplar relationship in too static or too one-dimensional of terms. I do think we need to broaden it to a certain extent. I don't think I would broaden it to things as much as we were talking about earlier, although, you know, when I go into the forest, I am inspired by trees. The trees have a kind of nobility and a kind of regalness, and they show patience, and they're kind of awe-inspiring. But do they exemplify in a way that I could try to emulate, maybe in some metaphorical sense? But I think this is actually why I would emphasize the human dimension of exemplarism, because it really does emphasize what kind of moral, intellectual communities we have around us and who we're looking to sort of guide us and in the classroom. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thanks.
To me, I would say, I guess I understand what you mean. It's not also the semantics of the fragment is not meant like some kind of postmodern thinking of things not being connected before, but just more than to direct the view on things in the world. We're dealing with digital education and going out into going out and dealing with materials and with something it's also a corporal moment. It's a corporal moment of going with your body out and moving and take things that you don't like in your hands and dealing with things on a different way. And it's the idea not more of community, but also of seeing things in a new way. And yeah, that's to me what I thought is exemplary. So just to if it's the wood or it's people, just to not to learn to think again, not two-dimensionally, but go back to the three-dimensional world. And also again the recognition of the little things and the ugly things, and just not the classics of what you have to be taught. And yeah, let me think about what I was saying. Just like that you connect the structure, the narrow structure of maybe also a neoliberal education. When I talk to my teacher friends who say we have less time for things and we have to teach this and this and this and we have to hush through things, and then this idea of going out, taking yourself some time and giving yourself some time to see what is interesting to you, but also again reconnecting those to ideas of what is important in in education. This is also very important, not only have this fragments, but also reconnecting. This is what I think is the core idea here with Benjamin.
Great. Shall we move on to the next question? It's Glenn. There you are.
Hello. This was a wonderful panel, and if I stutter a little, I'm sorry. I'm still waking up over here, and it's a great way to wake up. Actually, a little cornflakes and some coffee and exemplar. Hopefully, I'm asking a germane question here, but I think Morten had mentioned something that just really struck me, and also Douglas and all of you, that really very profound way you're talking, that the notion of, for example, is kind of part of the human condition. It's hard not to learn without saying, for example, X, Y, and Z. In being with autistic persons, I wanted to ask the question: is there what's the possibility of a non-exemplary situation? Are we ever out of the for example place? I mean, my mind is kind of wild now. Part of me is thinking of the old statement by the Buddha, if you meet the Buddha on the street, kill him, and where you just get rid of the exemplar. But I'm also thinking about, Marceline and Simon's work, Defense of the Public, and in a time of exemplars, do we ever get out of them? Is there any place of asylum where we could have time out from the exemplary situation? Or are we doomed to always have exemplars constantly coming in, constantly either from Spinoza's point of view, clouding my imagination, from Nietzsche's point of view, transcending myself or learning from the tragic figure, from Benjamin, piecing together things, constantly arranging them, and from Arendt's position here, creating some sort of public space. Is there ever any peace of mind, or are we, and I'm thinking also of Marceline and Simon, where he's talking about the amateur teacher who just does it out of love for the subject, and they're really trying not to be influential. In fact, they're trying to let go of their influence. Does that make any sense, or am I just kind of rambling in a weird sort of way? But thank you. It really got me thinking. But I wanted to get out of this notion that all our exemplars, even if we learn from the failures, which I liked with the Nietzschean part, what happens when there are other worlds and we speak past each other? Can we just be alone in the presence of other people without any defense? Can I just be here with you right now, or do I have to take some of you as my exemplars? Thank you.
Yeah, that was a really wonderful reflection, Glenn. I really enjoyed that. It also knocked me off my feet. I'm not sure what to say. Although going back to Louisa's question, I think there is definitely an attempt at creating those kinds of spaces by eliminating the exemplary. And one example is the strong tendency, for example, in teacher education, you get new students, and these students, they're very interested in getting answers. They want to know how to solve a conflict. They want to know what to do in particular situations. Then they're not particularly interested in having opened their mind or being existentially present. They're very much of a mind, many of them anyway, of just getting answers. And then as teachers in education programs, we're supposed to deliver those answers in the form of evidence. So we say, when in a conflict, you have to do this, and here's the evidence. We have a statistics, or we have a qualitative or quantitative data that backs up this kind of decision in that kind of situation, and so on, which in a sense can also, of course, I think, be understood as a form of giving examples, but they are examples that close down the communicative space. It doesn't open anything up. And I think that is the way, at least, that I want to take this work with exemplarity, to see how examples are not just trying to establish a connection between a particular instantiation of something and then a more general phenomenon, but something that permeates the way we talk to each other, and that can open up pedagogical spaces, as Nushin was talking about. And whether those are objects that we put on the table, to use Marceline and Simmons's words, or whether it's persons that are put on the table or that we use to open up these spaces, I think exemplarity is to me at least a better way to go than, for example, this tendency to want to deliver evidence or specific answers to these questions. So for me, that's at least one context, a reason why exemplarity now.
I'm just conscious of
Well
time.
said.
We only have 2 or 3 minutes, and we do have one more question. So I'd like to put a line under the responses to Glenn's question for a moment, and we go to Marit as the last question, and then if we could keep it brief, and we'll end on time today. Thank you.
Sure, I'll try to keep it. Thanks, all of you. I think my question or comment is related also to this in terms of in relation to education. And it seems most of you, except I think Morten is and also the two last are pointing in a slightly different direction, but it's very much connected to the individualism or to persons. So you connect exemplarity to the person present in education. Then a question comes up because in education, in didactics, exemplarity has always been there as part of a discussion around the content. And I think that sort of, I feel that is missing in this discussion. That discussion around exemplarity within didactics is always a question of what kind of content do I choose to teach? And why do I choose that content in terms of what? And I think that, because that way it doesn't get locked into this kind of therapeutic practices, which education tend to be discussed or become in many ways.
I have a quick response to that. I think that's a great point. And Marit, what I would say is that I think the most compelling teachers that I've had in my own past were the ones that somehow were able to embody the content of their discipline in some way. So they kind of erased the distinction between subject matter and teacher persona or personality or sort of methodology, and sort of like my favorite physics teacher, for example, was a true he loved physics. He would get physically excited. He would start sweating when he would be proving out some theorem. He would get excited when someone gave a right answer and would get visibly frustrated when we gave a wrong answer. And that embodiment, I think, is an indication that actually is something exemplary, actually. And so I would want to say that and also in learning too, in a way, you as a learner, in order to get the point of what you're learning, you kind of adapt yourself to the material. You go into states of flow, for example, if you're getting really good at it, and you're practicing one math problem over, and you kind of sort of become the material. And so I would say that the more we kind of erase that distinction, the better we are, the closer we are to our ideal. There, my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm really sorry, but time has kind of run out. And I think, Doug, you and I had the same physics teacher way back when. But this has been a really, really interesting, fantastically well thought out roundtable. So I want to thank Morten and Doug and Nushin and Johan for putting this together. And thank you for your conversation and your generous questions. And if you haven't done so already, please head over to inpe.info and become a member. You can see we're a pretty congenial group here, and we look forward to seeing you in future seminars or webinars, as the case may be. So take care, everybody.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for the sharing, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks, everyone.